food, energy, and public transportation. So we would convert to a energy efficient, renewably powered public transportation system. And it also forests, ensuring that we have water systems for our communities that are not toxic and providing people dangerous levels of lead in their water. And as a companion to this, we also call for an immediate ban on new fossil fuel infrastructure, as well as nuclear infrastructure, because for reasons I alluded to before, 100% clean renewable energy means wind, water, and sun, and it means an urgent phase out of both fossil fuels and nuclear. So to a couple of related areas, we call for a program which is nationally funded but largely locally controlled. So it is not a cookie cutter program dictated from Washington, D.C. Local communities decide through a democratic process known as participatory budgeting, which is essentially one person, one vote, not $1, one vote, as often takes place through our legislative process, where lobbying interests exert enormous influence behind closed doors. This is a process that is firewalled against special interest influence, so that communities are deciding what projects they will adopt. The program targets communities of greatest need first, areas of highest unemployment, which is largely communities of color in particular, where we know that unemployment rates are about double that of the average population. The program also assures workers and communities of a just transition. So for communities, for example, that are dependent on coal or that are dependent on fracking, they are assured that jobs will be replaced before people are laid off. No one will be laid off and denied an income and economic security for the idea that something good will happen in the future. We will ensure a just transition for workers as for communities, and this includes not only communities that are dependent on fossil fuels, for example, or coal, but it also includes communities that are dependent on the war industry, because we will be shifting of necessity many of the resources from the war economy, which is dangerous and unsustainable, into a green and peaceful and just economy. A couple other quick mentions. The cost is estimated to be about $500 billion in order to create 20 million jobs, and that's both direct and indirect jobs. And it's approximately 2/3 direct jobs and about 1/3 are indirect jobs produced as a consequence of the greater economic activity. The recipients of the funding are predominantly local businesses, small businesses, cooperatives, nonprofits, community-based organizations. That's how we ensure that these funds are used to revive our economy and are not taken overseas or out of state. The profits don't go somewhere else to corporate headquarters somewhere else. This is based on small local enterprises that essentially recirculate those dollars and make each one worth several times its value through what's called the multiplier effect in the economy. And I'm getting an approval from one of my economic advisors over there. How we pay for this? It's been shown through detailed studies, including Mark Jacobson out of Stanford, but other scientists out of Stanford University as well, who have shown that we save so much money by removing fossil fuel pollution, and there are hundreds of thousands of deaths, premature deaths every year in the United States from fossil fuel pollution alone. We save so much money that those savings alone are enough to pay the cost of the green energy transition. And that includes the transition to renewable energy. It also includes the cost of moving to sustainable forms of transportation. So it largely pays for itself in health savings alone. And that means reduced asthma, reduced emphysema, reduced heart attacks, reduced strokes, and reduced cancers, importantly. And if you said, well, those are just studies, there's actually a real world example of this in the country of Cuba, which lost its oil pipeline around 1990 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Suddenly, Cuba did not have fossil fuels coming in anymore. Overnight, they had to transition to basically walking and biking and public transportation and an organic and sustainable food system. So suddenly the air is clean, people have healthy food to eat, and they're using muscle power and public transit. You'd think with their economy crashing, their health would have taken a nosedive, but actually what really happened was their death rates from diabetes went down 50%, their death rates from heart attacks and strokes went down 30%, all-cause mortality went down about 18%. So they had a health revolution that cost them zero. We spend $3 trillion a year on what's not a healthcare system, it's a sick care system, because we're eating very poor nutrient poor industrial food. We're breathing lots of pollution, and our transportation system basically denies us recreation. So as part of our transportation system, we call for not only public transit, but also safe bike paths and safe sidewalks, so that we can use recreation as a form of transportation and be able to do that safely. So we have remarkable savings in healthcare. One other factoid there is that it's estimated about 75% of our $3 trillion a year healthcare bill is spent on chronic diseases, which would be prevented largely through an accessible, nutritious, locally based food system, ending pollution, and integrating physical activity into our lives through a public transportation system that includes the right to recreational transportation. Since the Green New Deal makes wars for oil obsolete, it enables us to substantially cut our bloated and dangerous military budget, which, mind you, is now 54% of our discretionary budget, over $600 billion for those expenses, but there are many that are actually in addition to that, including our nuclear weapons expenditures and so on. So reliable sources say it's actually not $600 billion, it's actually $1 trillion a year. In any case, we can cut the military budget at least $300 billion and arguably well over that. That's additional funding here. We call for a carbon tax of about $60 per ton, which would yield approximately $360 billion per year, additional resources. We call for increasing the estate tax to where it was during the Reagan years, not only because it provides needed income, but it also helps create a more balanced economy rather than the one we have developed now, where wealth and resources are predominantly in the hands of the top 1%. And that would yield something like $25 billion per year if it was returned to Reagan-era levels. And we also call for a financial transaction tax, which could yield anywhere from $100 billion up to $300, and according to some estimates, the National Nurses United, they would like to see it at something like 0.5%, which would yield something like $300 billion per year. And the point is here, everybody's paying a sales tax except Wall Street. You know, why is it that the most profitable industry in the United States is not sharing the burden like the rest of us? So this is certainly a just and necessary thing to do. But the bottom line being, this largely pays for itself, but there are many tax measures that we can use in addition to help jumpstart this program. And it's a win-win-win, but it's more than a win. It's an absolute necessity, because each month now is setting a new world record for climate change and for global warming. The science is telling us that the day of reckoning is coming closer. We cannot sit around and just wait for the crisis to engulf us. If we want to solve this problem, we need to start now. This isn't something that can wait another 4 years. We are really at the closing of the window right now as we speak. In many ways, this is an existential moment here where we decide whether we are going to have a future or not. So thank you again for your kind attention. Thank you for being here. Would you like to make any remarks at this point, John?
I can make some very short remarks and really gear my remarks to any questions that may come up regarding the overall program that Dr. Stein just laid out. Very briefly, I just wanted to just suggest that there are elements in this program that are truly progressive. And I want to call people's attention to that. You know, we focus on the issue of jobs, and that's very, very important, because jobs is the basis of being able to realize human dignity. And we know that we have a crisis of jobs here in this country with the transition that's taking place, with the disappearance of jobs, with the fact that 5 million people have basically disappeared from the labor market. We know people are suffering, even though the stats say otherwise. So having a program that is fully committed to full employment is fundamentally important. Having a program that's targeted to those communities, to those sectors that are now the most impacted is very, very important also, when people understand the importance of that targeting. The other idea here is that this is a program that is community-based, that is part of the movement here in this country for developing local community power. The idea that we can funnel resources directly from the federal government to the communities, bypassing, if we can, and we have to talk about how we do this, bypassing those states that are in the hands of these retrograde forces, these reactionary forces from the Republican Party, is very, very important. It helps to empower the communities to be able to empower themselves, and that be completely dependent on these reactionary state governments. Very, very important. The notion that in the planning of this new economy, the development of this new economy, that it empowers people to be direct participants is a principle that this party and this campaign stands for. That basically we talk about participatory budgeting, participatory planning. That's a fundamental component of this program. That's people-centered work, people-centered empowerment. Human rights. All of these elements relate to the commitment of this campaign to upholding and expanding people-centered human rights. When you talk about something like transportation, for example, people don't think about that in human rights terms. But the right to transportation is, in fact, a human right. It's a human right because it connects with all the other fundamental human rights. If you have people who are transport dependent, and you don't have the ability of those people to have access to public transportation, then how do you realize your right to education if you can't get to the schools? Or your right to health care if you can't get to the clinic or to the hospital? You know? These rights are fundamentally connected. So public transportation as a human right is something that we have to think about in a different way, and we have to uphold and expand. And when you look at this program and you connect it to the other components of our platform, you see that what we are advocating for is something that's truly, in many cases, revolutionary. It truly will result in the empowerment of the people. It is a program that's not dependent on the magic of the market. We've seen the magic of the market in creating the conditions we face today. It is a program that suggests there has to be cooperation, communication with market forces in order to address the real objective material needs of the vast majority of the people here in this country. So I just wanted to make those very brief comments.
Thank you. So, open it up to a few questions. Yes, in the back.
Yes, Dr. Stein, I would like to know first if you have any comment or reaction to one of the top stories on the political world in the US here, and it is the resignation of Paul Manafort, the campaign manager for Mr. Trump. Do you have any comment on that? And on the new Green Deal, I would like to know which do you believe is the issue that you would like to work first if you're elected the next president of the United States?
Great. Okay, so just to clarify, your question about the Green New Deal is sort of which aspect we want to focus on?
Yeah, which would you like to begin to work first
Yes.
if you're elected the next president of the United States?
Thank you. Okay. And about Paul Manafort, I think it reflects the chaos and the desperation within the Donald Trump campaign, that they are flailing, trying to find the right campaign manager, but they have the wrong candidate, so I wish them luck. And I'd say we're witnessing kind of a meltdown of the Republican Party, a revolt of its base that has come to recognize that its leadership is not, what shall we say, accountable to the base, and we have a base which is rather confused right now and subject to demagoguery in the form of Donald Trump. And so we're seeing the Republican candidate abandoned by his party, by the leadership. The proposal from the Wall Street Journal the other day that the Republican Party stop funding Donald Trump's campaign after Labor Day. So I mean, this is just jaw-dropping. We're looking at a party that is unraveling at the seams, while Hillary Clinton has been appealing to Republicans to come into her party. And as the Republicans are falling apart, the Democrats continue moving to the right, as indicated by Hillary Clinton's choice of her transition director, Ken Salazar, who represents, he's the lobbyist's lobbyist, and in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry, whose appointment really unveils the real Hillary Clinton who would take office, because that's what he is doing, is determining who the human faces are of the would-be Clinton administration. And we are seeing, the man in charge is the friend of the fossil fuel industry, strongly supports fracking, supported the KXL pipeline, and is likely to, approve or see that these pipelines are approved in the future. And he also supports the Trans-Pacific Partnership, underscoring what Terry McAuliffe said the other day about, don't worry about, Hillary Clinton, she'll be back with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So, when people say, but hasn't the Democratic Party moved to the left? Well, talk is cheap, and we're seeing how much faith people should put into the new, the new vision of the Democratic Party under Hillary Clinton. So buyer beware. On the question of the New Deal, it really comes as a piece, and it comes as a piece which empowers local communities to use these resources to create jobs, local small businesses and worker cooperatives, and allows communities to define how they meet these goals of justice and sustainability. So, what I see as the critical first step, really, is simply to get that process going, particularly in the lowest income communities and communities of color, the communities that are really threatened with the failing fossil fuel industry, the coal country, fracking country, etc., where people are really worried about losing their jobs and where people already don't have the jobs. To me, if we focus on our economic crisis, meeting those jobs needs with healthy, sustainable jobs in the food and energy and transportation systems, it's going to kind of sort itself out, and we will get a whole lot healthier in the process. So, my main concern is to get it going. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I take a scoot a little
Sure,
closer?
sure,
Sorry.
yeah.
I don't want to ruin anyone's shot. Thank you. Is that all right? Yeah. All right. I wanted to ask you about your proposal about student debt and quantitative easing.
Sure.
What is the purpose of the Fed?
So our larger purpose here is to get students out of debt and to liberate a generation that's held hostage by unpayable debt, no good jobs, don't have a place to live, don't have a family, the birth rate is crashing, the climate is unraveling on their watch. So our main goal here is to do for the students what our political establishment did for Wall Street, and that is come up with the resources in the needed time frame to bail out Wall Street. We can do that for students. So our first proposal is that we have the Fed essentially buy up the debt and essentially cancel that debt by expanding the money supply, which amounts to putting real resources into the hands of everyday people, so that as students earn their money, instead of paying back debt, pouring that money into a black hole, their dollars instead are their own to spend into that economy.
Right, but what is the purpose of the Fed? By statute, what is the purpose of the Fed?
You know, I can't quote you the statute, but the Fed is intended to maintain the stability of the economy, to actually reduce unemployment, and ensure that the monetary system is working.
It has two, right, it has two purposes.
Yes.
It reduces
Yes.
unemployment, and the other one is keep inflation running. So
That's
this would be
right.
a new purpose for the Fed. It would never have been used before, even though you can make the case that with the bailout with the banks, it was used, but it was for that purpose. This would be a new purpose. So would you change the statute? Do you have a radical rethinking of the purpose of the Fed?
So I'll have a more detailed answer for you when we roll out our complete plan on canceling student debt.
Okay, what exact instruments would the Fed buy under quantitative easing?
So we'll have a more detailed explanation for you when we issue our plan on that.
All right, I'd like to ask you a couple questions about what you just said with the environment. State of emergency, you said declare a state of emergency. What would the bones on that be? What would the meat on that be, rather than, or is it mostly rhetoric? What would the state of emergency entail?
I
What
see. Yes.
rules, what laws would be suspended under this state of emergency?
Right, so we are not talking about suspending laws or rules. We're talking about a national mobilization that really understands the stakes of what we are facing.
So the commonality between the Fed proposal, the quantitative easing, and the state of emergency is going around Congress because they can't even pass cap and trade. So wouldn't this worry someone who worries about the expansive powers of the executive, what you're proposing?
So the working with the Fed to bail out students like they bailed out Wall Street, it's analogous to the steps and the extraordinary measures that the Fed took in the face of the Wall Street meltdown. So to that extent, this is not new. And it would rely on the existing authority of the Fed to meet a state of economic emergency. In terms of the Green New Deal, we don't have a magic bullet for that under presidential authority. And that's why, to my mind, it's very important that we be clear about the stakes of the climate crisis. And that's why acknowledging the true state of emergency that we are in, where unfortunately the crisis of the fires in California and the floods in Louisiana are going to become more and more day-by-day occurrences, where we're looking at a potentially catastrophic sea level rise within our lifetimes. That is quite a motivator in my experience. And in fact, the American people already weigh in on poll after poll that they want substantial action on climate change that actually meets the degree of the crisis that we're facing. So in my view, meeting this crisis amounts to empowering the American people to instruct their elected officials what we need to do to meet that crisis, so that we actually have Congress acting on behalf of the American people. Now, it's well known that normally Congress acts on behalf of its lobbying interests. And I could cite for you the Gillens and Page study if you didn't believe everyday experience. that study showed that in fact policies as passed by Congress and coming out of Washington DC are largely driven by big financial interests, not by the public interest. So we would need to exert enormous efforts in order to get Congress to do the right thing, but on occasion this does happen. Often in the past it's been a matter of stopping Congress from acting in a destructive way when, for example, Congress was going to privatize the internet. And that legislation was stopped by an enormous grassroots mobilization that instructed our elected officials not to act on behalf of the industry, but rather to act on behalf of everyday people. So there are precedents for when we mobilize. This is why it's so important that we have someone in the White House who can actually inform and empower people to do the things that we need to do on behalf of the American people.
No more questions, please. Yes, and any other questions? Okay, go ahead.
Dr. Stein, please. During this electoral cycle, we've heard a lot about student debt at the college level.
Yes.
But as we see in New York City has both some of the worst and best school districts, K through 12, in the United States of America. What does the Green Party have in store for just the K through 12 public education system as part of the Green New Deal? If you can speak to that, that'd be great.
Great. Okay, so just to clarify, we separate education from the Green New Deal, but it is a critical, part of our agenda. So we call for adequately, fully funding our public schools in every community. And that means increasing the education budgets. It also means that we address the issues that prevent our students from being able to learn, and that students need to come to school ready to learn. That means they need to come healthy and ensure that they have health care. They need to come well-nourished, which is a problem when you're living in a food desert. And they need to come free from poverty, which is the greatest obstacle to actual learning. So the other areas of our agenda address those concerns. In addition, we call for a school system that teaches to the whole student for lifetime learning, that does not try to substitute high-stakes testing for real and adequate education. And in fact, we oppose reliance on high-stakes testing and instead support teaching to the whole student for lifetime learning. We oppose the use of high-stakes tests to essentially shut down the schools of communities that are in poverty. And we oppose the use of high-stakes testing to threaten teachers and to undermine unions. And we acknowledge that some of the leaders of so-called education reform are actually not sending their kids to the kinds of schools that enact those reforms. They send their kids to schools that have small classroom size, that pay their teachers well, and that provide enriched curriculum with art, music, and recreation. And that's what we feel should be the model for all schools.
Can I make it?
Yeah.
Just very briefly on that, I think it's very important, and I think Dr. Stein's comment that integrates the Green New Deal program and the other components of our platform reinforces the point that I made, that all of these together represent a really transformative kind of program. This notion of education, the challenge of effective education is really the challenge of the time also. One of the reasons why we have the disparities in education is because of how education is usually funded throughout the country. The fact that education is funded based on property values automatically ensures inequality in the quality of education that people have access to. So the funding that we have to direct from the national government will be based on a formula that we will create that will attempt to shore up, if you will, those school districts that happen to be districts that are low income, impoverished, so that they can have an equal chance to really develop their young people also. We also have to have, we have to reverse the process of centralizing these curriculums. You know, it's interesting and kind of tickles me that, you know, some of the forces that talk about states' rights and all of that have no problem with the centralization